Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Susan Frazier. I'm the Senior Director for the Greenhouse Project, and I am really excited for today's continuation of cultural transformation, kind of building on the Greenhouse 2.0 initiative. I talked about cultural transformation, but told you my colleague Marla DeVries would be going a little bit deeper to talk a little bit more about the how and the why. So before we get started, I want to remind you, if you're on today's webinar, that you are in listen-only mode. And that means that your phones are on mute, but that at the very end, Marla has saved some time for questions so that you'll be able to ask the questions that might come up during today's presentation. So let me introduce my colleague, Marla. Marla has been with the Greenhouse Project team for the last several years. I tell you, she has been one of these incredible finds that we've had along our journey of really wanting to find somebody that really gets the significance of education. And yesterday when she and I were talking, one thing I wrote down was, she says, education is a process, not an event. And I think that kind of sums up a lot of her approach to the work that we do and to how she has challenged us to think beyond the check-the-box education, to really look at cultural transformation as a process, not a singular event. So with that, Marla, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to take us through today's presentation.
All right. Thanks, Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for being a part of this hour conversation and to engaging the Greenhouse Project on this topic of cultural transformation. And before we jump in and I go through the session goal and the agenda, I wanted to give you a little bit of my background and experience. So I'm the Director of Resource Development. Susan said I've been with the team for several years. I think it's 6.5 right now. And I entered long-term care as a college graduate about 28 years ago when I answered an ad to be a resident advocate. And I had little prior experience or frankly interest in working in nursing homes or with elders, but I was intrigued by that term advocate. So I became a local long-term care ombudsman in Michigan. And so as an ombudsman, I had the opportunity to go into many local nursing homes and talk to many elders. I saw great nursing homes. I saw not so great nursing homes. And as I talked with the residents, I came to understand that what was important to them were really the same things that are important to you and me: to be known, to like their care partners, and to believe that their care partners liked them. And as an ombudsman, I got to be on the cutting edge of culture change in Michigan in the late 90s. I was a member of the first Culture Change Coalition in Michigan and later became a board member and then employee of a culture change organization that brought culture change across the state. And then in 2009, I moved out to Utah to be the culture change point person for a small not-for-profit organization that operated 5 homes across the state, including one site for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then in 2013, I joined the Greenhouse Project team. So I give you that history, not because it's necessarily so remarkable or unique. And in fact, I would say every member on our team at Greenhouse has a similar culture change tale of how they work to drive culture change in long-term care organizations in various states. And it really is this experience, coupled with the experience of numerous greenhouse adopters, that's led us to the development of our cultural transformation process that I'm excited to share with you today. So I'm going to review the agenda and just say that this is a packed presentation with a lot of information. And my hope is that I give you some food for thought regarding your own culture change journey. So here's the path that I want to go down. First of all, overall, just to talk about our cultural transformation process as a practical option to improve your organizational culture and to give it that marketplace, that workforce, and that elder care advantage. And to get there, we're going to talk about what is the Greenhouse Project cultural transformation process, why is it important, and why is it a path to go down, and then how do we do it? How do we work with organizations? And I'll review the 4-step greenhouse transformation process, and then finally give you a couple takeaways for you to make an impact on your culture. So Susan outlined on a previous greenhouse webinar in early May our 2.0 initiative. And so hopefully many of you listened to that webinar. And if you didn't, there's a link here. And so when you get the slides, you can check out that webinar. So because she outlined it so well, I'm going to keep my comments around the what pretty brief. The greenhouse cultural transformation seeks to deinstitutionalize, destigmatize, and humanize care for all people, regardless of their living environment, in order for them to live meaningful and purposeful lives. Our goal is to eradicate institutional models of which the picture that you see is still a common practice. And we want to create something radically transformative. Greenhouse cultural transformation strives for what we call comprehensive change, addressing the physical environment, the philosophical culture, which, for example, is what we think about elders, what we think about our role in caring for them, as well as the organizational structure. So how we organize the work and how the work gets done. To do all those things together to produce deep, lasting, sustainable change. So there's a lot on this slide. Our cultural transformation process is rooted in our 3 core values, which you see on the upper left-hand corner: real home, meaningful life, and empowered staff. And if you look at the colors that are aligned, real home really looks at the physical environment, meaningful life is addressing the philosophical culture, and empowered staff looks at that organizational structure. And it's the interplay of those core values where the magic happens. And I call this synergistic transformation. So I'm kind of a definition junkie. I love to look up the definition of words because I believe words have power and words can move us to action. So I looked up the definition of synergy and I wrote it there, and I'm also going to read it. So synergy is the interaction of elements that, when combined, produce a total effect that is greater than the sum of the individual elements. And I'm sure you've heard the saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's that place where these 3 elements come together that's, I like to call it the sandbox in which Greenhouse thrives. So I want to give you one example of this synergistic transformation. So take, for example, in greenhouse homes, there's a lot of attention on the physical environment and the transformation that happens and how wonderful it is. And it is wonderful, a small environment where each elder has his or her own room and a private bathroom. So that's a pretty deep and radical change to the physical environment. Or take the organizational structure of the self-managed work team in a greenhouse environment with a small, consistent group of care partners who deeply know each of the elders. That too is a pretty radical change in the organizational structure. Or finally, let's take a change in the philosophical structure found in greenhouse homes, in which elders have autonomy and control and own the rhythm of their day. So each of these elements taken alone can be significant. However, I would say it's the interplay of the 3, the synergy of elders having their own space that facilitates deep knowing, that supports autonomy and control, because as an elder, I get to choose to close my door. I can seek solitude or I can seek engagement, and the consistent care partners know me and understand me. So the real impact is in the interaction of each of these elements to produce a total effect that is greater than any individual element. So the same is true in what's possible in more traditional environments, if we think about the interplay of the elements and what transformation is truly possible. So that's synergistic transformation. So that is a bit of what it is. It's that synergistic transformation when we concentrate on the three elements working together. So the next question is why? Why consider Greenhouse as a partner in cultural transformation? So to answer the why, I thought we'd think like a Jeopardy contestant. And you don't have to be a James Holzhauer or a Ken Jennings to play this round. So remember, in Jeopardy, we have the answer, and what we need to identify is the question. So if the answer is, it's the Greenhouse Project Cultural Transformation Process, the question is, what is the path to which organizations can thrive in a VUCA environment? So everywhere I turn lately, what I'm reading, the other webinars that I'm on, everyone seems to be talking about VUCA. So this notion of VUCA, it might be something you're familiar with, or it might be a new term for you. It was actually introduced back in 1987 at the U.S. Army War College to describe the more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, what they called multilateral world, which resulted from the end of the Cold War. And then the acronym itself, VUCA, was coined in the late 90s. So thinking about each of these, and I want you to think about long-term care. So if something is volatile, it's subject to fluctuations and change. If we're in a time of uncertainty, there's some instability, and we have to sometimes take action without having all of the information. If we think of a time as being complex, it may be that there are dynamic variables and it can be pretty overwhelming in scope. And then finally, if it is an ambiguous time, there's multiple cause and effect factors. So when I hear that and I think about long-term care, I think we might be in a time of VUCA. When Susan did the May webinar, and one of the things she did was poll the audience about what keeps you up at night. And if you were on that webinar, you might remember that overwhelmingly the majority of respondents said what keeps them up at night is workforce issues and turnover. So just to add to that, in a 2018 Greenhouse webinar, Lisa McCracken of Ziegler talked about that turnover for direct care staff in long-term care is at about 40%. That doesn't come as a surprise probably to anybody on this webinar. And then with that, Lisa talked about the reality is that between 2014 and 2024, we're going to be adding another 262,000 nursing assistant jobs. And that we're in a time, kind of a unique time, in which census levels are being adjusted based on staffing. And quite often, it had been the reverse. So when you think of the task of attracting and retaining quality staff, it's at a time that I've not seen of greater priority. So I would say the workforce challenge qualifies as a time of VUCA. As I was preparing for this presentation, I also looked at a book that I picked up a couple years ago. It was written in 2016, and it's called An Everyone Culture, published by the Harvard Business School. And it identifies organizations that have adapted in a VUCA time and calls them deliberately developmental organizations. And the Everyone culture identifies 3 commonalities that deliberately developmental organizations have. So number 1, they're intuitive and they have a practical grasp on how to accelerate people's development. So they prioritize people's development. Number 2, they take those concepts to scale so that it is, as the title says, it's an everyone culture. It's not just that they are developing certain people, but these organizations are impacting systems so everyone has the opportunity to develop. And finally, number 3, they nourish a culture that puts the business and personal development and the way that they support one another front and center. So it is a both and culture, saying how do we have good business results and how do we have good personal results of growing people. So an everyone culture talks about these DDO organizations as being incubators of capability and an accelerator of people's growth. And they link human potential and organizational potential. So as I was reading that, and reading about the positive results that they're having in human capital and business capital, I think about what's possible with greenhouse organizations. So there's often confusion out there about how to write or spell the greenhouse portion of the greenhouse project. And it's often written as greenhouse, one word. And so at greenhouse, we'll often say, well, greenhouse, one word, grows plants, and greenhouse, 2 words, grows people. So organizations dedicated to the synergistic transformation and the application of the core value of empowered staff, I believe, are incubators of human potential, and they can thrive in VUCA. And one more comment about thriving in VUCA. I'm not sure if you've heard of the GNH, or the Gross National Happiness Measure. Whole countries, the United Nations, individual organizations are looking at this. They're looking at how do we identify what makes people happy, and how do we measure it in our society or in our organization. And in the workplace, I think there's this misconception that happiness is thought of in terms of, well, we need to have flexible work hours, or pool tables, or dartboards, or, all of these fabulous perks. I kind of envision this break room where there are just huge bowls of M&Ms that anybody can go and grab. And so what the authors of An Everyday Culture offer is a different view of happiness. And they say it's really the process of human flourishing, giving people work that is engaging, that provides growth, that is work of significance or relevance, that has purpose and meaning. And so I take what they're saying about how do we get to that gross national happiness and look at the greenhouse model, which is to grow people and to foster work that is meaningful. I mentioned the 3 core values, and one of which is meaningful life. And it's generally thought of in terms of the elders. It's that philosophical construct of providing purposeful, meaningful engagement for the elders in which they're the authors of their lives. But I also think about if we expand our view of meaningful life to include all in the community, including the care partners. So what if growing people included giving them opportunities to create something, to contribute to other people, to have work of relevance, significance, purpose, and meaning? So greenhouse, 1 word, grows plants. Greenhouse, 2 words, grows people. So Meg, I'd like to launch our first poll, which I think gets at growing people. So I'm not able to see it. So if either you or Susan could walk through, I'm not sure I'm able to see it.
Yeah. So here's the question. Rate your organization in growing people, creating work that is meaningful, relevant, significant, and purposeful. So you've got 4 options there. The poll is open, so I would appreciate everybody just selecting one of those 4 options. And we'll take just a minute to have you all work on it. Okay, we are good. So it looks like we've got, I'm going to close the poll. And those are the results. Can you see those, Marla?
I can't, for whatever reason.
Okay, so let me read them. So the highest was 50% said we have some elements of growing people in our culture. We have 19%, our workplace is built for flourishing. We got this. And another 19% said, frankly, growing plants sounds way easier. And finally, 12% said, we are too focused on surviving in VUCA to grow people. So I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. So interesting. And certainly I think that is true, that some days growing plants does sound easier, but there is a lot of meaning if we can figure out how to survive in a time of VUCA and create work that both has a positive business impact as well as impacting individuals. So that's the first Jeopardy question. How do we thrive in a time of VUCA? So the second one, and remember, the answer is, it's the Greenhouse Project Cultural Transformation Process. And the question is, how can long-term care organizations prepare to meet the needs and demands of boomers? So that Ziegler presentation that I referenced, Lisa McCracken talked about that boomers want choices and options, and that doesn't come as a surprise to any of us, and that the nursing home residents of tomorrow are going to have increasing mental health needs. So it's a dynamic time of change, not only regarding the workforce, but also looking at the needs of consumers. And, you know, if you think about consumer demand and really getting that share of the marketplace, a recent study said nearly 40% of skilled nursing organizations in recent years underwent either expansion or repositioning. So moving to households or other types of conversions. So the reality is that the competition is moving forward to get its share of the market. And so if you're standing still, it could be that you're falling behind. So at Greenhouse, we focus on creating what we call relationship-rich, person-directed living, regardless of the constraints of the physical structure. So certainly, as we discussed earlier, a progressive physical environment can better support meaningful life, autonomy, control, and honoring one's natural rhythms. But without the small house environment, one that whispers at every corner, real home, we need to get creative. And we need to focus even more on that relationship-rich, person-directed environment and deep knowing and fostering relationships throughout the community. We have to focus on what's possible, and then we have to stretch even a little more. So, last Jeopardy question, 2, the answer being it's the Greenhouse Project Cultural Transformation Process. And the question is, how can we move from a programmatic approach to culture change to a sustainable, true organizational transformation? So again, that Greenhouse 2.0 webinar that Susan conducted, she talked about the Miller survey, which was conducted 10 years ago in 2009 and 10, in which 85% of nursing homes self-reported that they were engaging in culture change. So that's a very high percentage. And I look at that as both good news and bad news. So the good news is overwhelmingly most organizations are trying to implement change. The bad news is that it doesn't look like it's enough, because this is still the sentiment expressed in our society. I'd rather die than move into a nursing home. So I think we have to take a good look at ourselves in long-term care and ask ourselves if we're doing enough to change this perception. Are we doing enough to eradicate the institutional model? Are we doing enough to destigmatize elder care, or enough to humanize care? So a number of years ago, prior to coming to the Greenhouse Project, I had the opportunity to speak at a breakout session at the ACA conference. So the ACA is a for-profit association. And the topic was culture change. And so I pulled that presentation up, and I want to share just a couple slides. So the topic was, do you want to tweak or do you want to transform? And I didn't really realize it at the time, but it was a rather provocative question. So don't get me wrong, I'm all for anything that improves the quality of life and care in today's nursing homes. And yet we need to ask ourselves, are we moving the needle enough with our programmatic approaches, such as a new meal plan program or a welcoming program, or kind of some of those what people call, creating a home-like environment? Is it doing enough? I'll share I won't share the entire presentation, but I wanted to share at least one additional slide. So this was the comparison of adopting a culture change philosophy, or now I might say a cultural transformation process, versus that programmatic approach. So programmatic approaches only get us so far in this time of VUCA. And if we're trying to attract and retain the right talent and attract today and tomorrow's consumers, I believe we need to move beyond a programmatic approach. So I learned this quote, first heard this quote about 20 years ago, and I think it's worth reflecting on. All organizations are perfectly aligned to get the results they get. So ask yourself, do you believe that? And if you believe it, what does that mean for you and for your own organization? Another parallel quote to this is, well, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And we've all probably heard the definition of insanity as doing the same thing and expecting different results. So I encourage you, as you examine your culture and you're not happy with the results you're getting, to take a look at the systems, take a look at the practices and strategies that you have in place. You are perfectly aligned to get the results you're getting. Because this quote, the previous picture, and I'll just go back quickly, that's not the result we want. But I look at this quote and also see it as a positive affirmation of what's possible. So the question then is, how do we align ourselves to results that we want? Before I share the how of the Greenhouse Cultural Transformation process, I want to share one additional piece of research, which comes from an organization called Achieve Forum, and it really has helped to shape the how we work with organizations. So Achieve Forum is a company out of Boston, and they conduct a lot of studies, and they work in various fields to help organizations. And they conducted this global study of business people in a variety of both middle management and executive roles. And they initially conducted this study back in 2009, and then they repeated it in 2012. And they had very similar results. They were seeking to understand what makes behavior change stick. And what they identified through both studies is that this number 14%. So in both studies, only 14% of organizations reported being successful in making behavior change stick. And that in fact, 2/3 or 63% said they were either not effective at all or only somewhat effective in making behavior change stick. And what the study did was identify 3 phases to organizational change. So I'm going to review these quickly. So first phase is aligning. So aligning is kind of getting everyone on the same page, getting that common direction, having that vision, and communicating that vision to others. That's aligning. Then the next phase they called equipping. And equipping is providing the tools, the resources, and the training that people need for behavior change. And then finally, the third phase is sustaining. So sustaining is all of the things after aligning and equipping to really support and reinforce that behavior change. So it's the coaching, it's the ongoing reinforcement to carry that vision out and have people have a new behavior change. So we're going to launch a second poll. If I can have a little help from my friends at the greenhouse office.
Okay, the poll has been launched. Which of the 3 phases of transformation does your organization invest the most time? So we're going to give you a couple minutes to select one of the following. All right, 10 more seconds and we're going to close the poll. All right, poll is closing. And the answers. You all have said 50% said aligning, getting people on the same page is where you spend the most of your time. Equipping was number 2 at 42%, and 8% of you said sustaining was where you invested the most time. So back to you, Marla.
All right. Thanks, Susan. Okay, so let's compare your responses to what Achieve Forum found. And so what they found was a slightly different distribution from organizations. So organizations reported 20% said this is where we put our time and attention, and then 60% in equipping and 20% in sustaining. So next I want to share, but what's the overall impact? So Susan, I'm going to turn it back to you because we have one more poll.
Okay, we're going to launch number 3. All right, when it comes to making behavior change stick, which phase has the greatest impact? So the poll has been launched. Please give your answers. All right, 10 seconds to close. All right, poll is closed. And you have answered that aligning at 32%, equipping at 19%, and sustaining at 48%. So Marla, back to you.
All right. So I find it interesting, before I go to the results from Achieve Forum, what we've identified is that 92% of us say we devote our resources to either the aligning, that visioning part, or equipping, but yet 48% of us acknowledge that really where we make behavior change stick is by investing our resources in sustaining. So go back to a couple slides ago, we're perfectly aligned to get the results we're getting. So if we're not having that behavior change stick, likely it's because we haven't paid enough attention to what are we doing to sustain. So the numbers are slightly different, but not all that off. They said when it comes to where you have impact in making behavior change stick, you see the distribution there, that we get the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak, when we invest our time and our resources to sustaining. So when I first saw this research a few years ago, it was a wake-up call for me. So as someone that really has lived her professional life in that middle row of equipping others, educating others, only to find out that ultimately it wasn't making behavior change stick. That's a pretty sobering thought. And then I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the forgetting curve. So the forgetting curve was coined back in 1885 by a gentleman named Herman Ebbinghaus. And he did an experiment, and from it developed this theory that really has stood the test of time. And he called it the forgetting curve. And he showed that within 1 hour, people will have forgotten on average 50% of the information you presented. So it is going to be 4 o'clock when we close this. So at 5 o'clock, I can expect you to have lost 50% of what I talked about. And that within 24 hours, they will have forgotten on average 70% of the new information. And that within a week, the forgetting curve claims on average 90% of it is lost. So it's as if we're adding water to a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. Now, there are certainly things that can be done in the classroom to transfer the learning more into that long term and to combat the forgetting curve. And I'm very proud of the education that we have at the Greenhouse Project. But the bottom line is, if we don't do something to reinforce learning beyond the classroom, we're really wasting our effort and our resources, which is why, back to what Susan said earlier, I'm passionate about learning has got to be a process and not an event. So many of you may recognize this diagram. This is an extension of what we saw with Achieve Forum. So this is John Kotter's 8-step process of change, and it's been around since the early 90s. And this too has stood the test of time as a useful construct for how organizations can successfully undergo a transformation process. And when I saw the two come together, what we learn with the Achieve Forum and what Kotter tells us here, to me, it really spoke to me. So if you look at Kotter's 8 steps, and then you look at steps 1 through 3 as creating a climate for change, that's the aligning phase that Achieve Forum talks about. And then you look at steps 4 through 6 as engaging and enabling the whole organization. That's the equipping phase. And then you look at steps 7 and 8 as implementing and sustaining change. That's the sustaining change. So taking all of this information, let me unpack how the Greenhouse Project guides an organization through the process of cultural transformation. So this is the how. So we have identified 4 phases of the Greenhouse cultural transformation process: to assess, to equip, and to sustain. So the following slides outline each phase. And I think it's important to note, and I put this in a circle, these are non-linear phases, and the process is really adaptive and dynamic and highly variable, and it's based on each organization's culture. So you see that Achieve and John Kotter identify the 3 phases, and we've added a 4th, which we put as the first, as an important starting place. So organizations need to understand who they are and what's their starting point. They need to analyze what's possible from a financial, cultural, and organizational perspective. And we have several tools and processes that help with that assessment process. And an organization also needs to have a clear understanding of what its strengths are as well as its challenges. Or at Greenhouse, what we like to label as opportunities. And so our goal is to really amplify your culture, to help you to do more of what you already do well. And so this initial phase of Greenhouse cultural transformation is assessing what is and what can be. So then we have the aligning phase, the second phase, which Kotter calls creating a climate for change. So it's a time of developing a clear vision for what will be the same and what will be different in the new culture. It's the playing in the sandbox of that synergistic transformation to identify how will changes in the physical environment or the philosophical structure or organizational practices really come together to create a transformed, sustainable culture. So it's also a time of high multi-stakeholder engagement. So Kotter speaks of building what he calls the guiding team, and at Greenhouse, we identify multiple opportunities for engagement. So we have the development of what we call the guiding leadership team. We have the process of developing an implementation team who is charged with creating the action plan for living out the vision. And then ultimately, as the process unfolds, there are work groups with representatives of all care partner roles who are empowered to carry out the action plan. So it's really like a bit like a pebble in a pond. It's these ripples of engagement that extend to the farthest reaches of the organization. So assess, align, and then next comes equipping. So equipping is a phase that's pretty familiar to many of us. It's the robust process of, at Greenhouse, project management and education to equip the organization with the tools and the resources to successfully implement the vision that's created in the aligning phase. And I'm just going to highlight, there's many tools in our Greenhouse equipping toolkit, and I just want to mention a couple. So as I said, I'm very proud of the education that we have at Greenhouse. And core education is our signature education class for all team members. And it explores the application of the core values in a Greenhouse environment as well as in a transforming legacy environment. And this year, we combined our core value education with our Best Life approach, which is our unique approach to supporting persons living with dementia. And then we also have courses in our education toolkit that help establish a collaborative coaching culture in your organization. And then finally, the 4th phase of Greenhouse cultural transformation is the sustaining phase. And that's to deeply root the change process into the organizational systems and practices to create what we call slip-resistant change. So Kotter talks about to deeply root change into the fabric of the organization, it's a process that can take 5 to 10 years. So this isn't a quick check the box process. It is an opportunity to celebrate successes along the way and to not let up and keep reinforcing the vision and keep reinforcing the education. So this is where we see learning is a process and not an event, or it's everything that comes after the classroom. It's the coaching, it's the reinforcement, it's the belief in the application of not only is learning a process, but learning is the responsibility of the whole organization and not just the educator and the learner. It's also the responsibility of the direct supervisor, and it's the responsibility of the whole executive team. So one of the unique resources at the Greenhouse Project is a tool used in a couple different phases because it both assesses and helps to sustain the culture. So Merit is our model enrichment resource and integrity tool. It is a multi-stakeholder assessment. It's an online tool to look at model fidelity. So how do the core values get lived out in an environment? So it was originally designed specifically for greenhouse homes, and we have since adapted it to a legacy environment. And what this assessment does is identify strengths, so elements where real home empowered staff and meaningful life are alive and well as where there are opportunities for further growth or where there maybe has been slippage. So previously we were doing better in this area, and now we've slipped and we've let what we call the institutional dragon creep back in. So that, in a nutshell, is the Greenhouse Project cultural transformation process. And I would say it's tailored to each organization, and it leverages over 15 years of the greenhouse model to support that synergistic transformation in a legacy environment. So when I introduced the agenda for this session, the final item was to outline some takeaways, some tools for you to have an immediate impact on your organization. And so I'm sharing here our learning framework, which is a simple tool that you can use to make change happen and to make it stick. And it's really looking at these three things. What are the beliefs we have? What are the behaviors? And what are the systems that need to be present? So I'll go through a quick example. So let's say as an organization, you have identified, you have a desire or a vision to improve the autonomy and control elders have. And specifically, you want to address that elders have the ability to access the outdoors. So many organizations have wonderful patios, and with the weather improving, you say we want elders to be able to have access to the outdoors. So the behavior you want to change is elders accessing outdoors and care partners facilitating that activity. So that's the behavior. So in order for that new behavior to happen, not just once, but really to weave itself into the fabric of the organization, you need to look at both beliefs and systems. So with beliefs, it's looking at what are the current beliefs people in our organization have about elders accessing outdoors? What fears do we have? And then looking at what are the new beliefs that need to be present in order for that behavior of elders accessing outdoors to be supported. So for example, care partners would need to embrace elder autonomy. We need to understand and we need to be okay with that idea, that dignity of risk. And then in addition to identifying new beliefs that we need to embrace and the new behaviors or actions we take, we also have to look at and evaluate our own organizational systems. So without that, if we just look at the beliefs and behaviors and the systems aren't aligned, what I've heard is the system wins every time. So in this example, if the doors to the patio are locked, that's a system issue, then the system is working against our new beliefs and behaviors. Or if the outdoor space isn't at all an appealing environment for our elders, then that's a systems issue that's going to prevent us from being successful. Or if we have outdated policies that don't, quote unquote, allow elders to go outside unattended. So in order for true transformation to occur, you need to address all three elements in the learning environment, in the learning framework. So I have covered a lot of ground, and we have about 8 minutes. So I want you to think about any questions that you might have. I want to give you, kind of sum it up with 4 key takeaways for you. So the first is look for synergistic transformation. Look beyond programmatic approaches to that place where change in the physical environment improves the quality of life and care for the elders and really leverages an empowered culture. Secondly, leverage what's possible. So build upon your organization's strengths. Don't let your good prevent you from achieving your great. Third, take joy in the journey. And while I might sound critical of a programmatic approach to change, really small changes over time can make a big impact. So take time to celebrate each milestone. You eliminate care alarms, celebrate. Hands-on care partners are self-scheduling, celebrate. Waking and sleeping are happening according to an elder's natural rhythm and routine, celebrate. Take the time to have joy in the journey. And finally, don't run alone. So if you've never seen the video Team Hoyt, go to YouTube and find it. Hoyt is H-O-Y-T. It's about 4.5 minutes of inspiration, and it shares the story of Rick Hoyt, who was born not able to walk or talk. And several years ago, he communicated to his father, Dick, that he wanted to participate in a 5-mile benefit run. And so the video says, together they run. Marathons, triathlons, Ironmans. And the video says Rick couldn't run without Dick, and Dick wouldn't run without Rick. And so the video ends with 2 phrases, together has power, and don't run alone. So I thought about this in my own life, and I think about the power of together, and I'll give you one personal example. So a couple months ago, my husband and I joined a fitness boot camp. We're both somewhat athletic, and we found previous success in our own fitness program, but we decided that we wanted something more. And so there were really 2 things that attracted us to the boot camp. So first of all, it was that the leaders live and breathe fitness. Each of the coaches has a degree in exercise science or something similar, and they give us the one-on-one coaching that's both encouraging, but also helps us perfect our own technique. And they know how to push us and get the best out of each of us. And it is very different for each of us. And secondly, each time we hit the exercise mat, we're surrounded by a company of peers, some who are farther along on their fitness journey and others who are just starting. And so we encourage and support one another. Now, we could do it ourselves, but we believe that the results are better when we are harnessing that power of together. And so I liken that to the power of Greenhouse. We are the experienced coaches on the mats, and we have access to the network of others pursuing cultural transformation. And so I encourage you to don't run alone.